and it is just about 2 p.m. CST. Hello and welcome to the Philosophy Chat. Thank you all for coming. We have 30 people here today, a little bit more than the few other times or the few last times we've had a few people. Today we're going to be basically going over the reviewing the debate that I had with Destiny last night. Life is Strange music. Yep, that definitely. It's just a great introduction to music, or a great introduction for the show to use as music, I should say. Hopefully there isn't too much back noise right now. I do have a fan in the back because it's really hot where I live. So hopefully I'm coming quite clear. So anyways, yeah, today I'm just going to go over the video. I'm going to go over questions and criticisms. I'll be taking questions or criticisms within the chat. However, there's already enough questions and criticisms within the YouTube feed that Destiny has. I've definitely made a few responses there. I think as far as those criticisms that were there, they ranged anywhere from fairly good questions to completely missing the point. That is, I think every single criticism that I saw, at least in the YouTube feed, completely missed the point. Now, there was one thread, however, made in Destiny's Reddit that I don't completely think missed the point. It was a genuinely substantive criticism, but it was a criticism of the empirical data that I presented and the examples that I presented for strong emergentism or radical kind emergentism that need to be amended or entirely jettisoned. In my, from how the conversation's going so far, it's not so much as a concession that's going to occur on my part, but just something that needs to be amended within the examples themselves. So I'm going to go over some of the criticisms that I'm seeing on YouTube and pull those up and then respond them vocally, although I've already sort of responded to them, non-vocally as well. That is, I wrote down certain types of criticisms there. Oh, the volume needs to be higher? Okay, I'll increase it right now. So let's switch over to the regular chat room and let's pull up the, let me pull up the browser if it's gonna let me this time. Sometimes it doesn't let me. Okay, so it's letting me this time. Okay, so the question, one of those questions is how often do you reconsider your positions? I think just about every month I have some sort of reconsideration on my positions. Now, I've always had certain types of non-reductive intuitions, so non-reductivism has sort of stayed with me through my philosophy for quite long-ish. I tend to have monistic tendencies, but I can see why certain people would uphold some form of ontological pluralism, meaning that there is no one way or two ways in which the world is kind of cut up. So it's not just a matter of immaterial or material things as carving the world up, but it could be the case that the world just has many different types of natures. I tend to hold ethical realism under heavy consideration for a fairly long period of time, and generally the interests that I have in the history of philosophy have generally been within German idealism. So anyways, to go to the criticisms here, and this is actually the comment of where I wrote down that I replied to some of them. I'm going to look at the ones that I sort of replied to, and some of the comments as well. So, some of the comments like, is it just me or does Marty seem like an undercover religious apologist? These are just kind of comments that I sort of laugh at, If you guys don't know what I am, I'm a panentheist. I don't really have any sort of religious convictions, but I also don't scoff at religious convictions or religious beliefs. I think when it comes to theology and the philosophy of religion, it gets really, really hairy in trying to defend or attack a classic theistic conception of God, and I just think that those arguments are generally really, really misunderstood. I was actually watching a debate with Cosmic Skeptic on William Lane Craig, and just the things that Cosmic Skeptic was saying in that debate, I just completely thought missed the point as well. And didn't really get onto the criticisms of what classic theism is trying to give of certain types of materialistic and positions and positions without a God. So let's look at some other comments then. So here is a comment basically saying something that my assessment of free will is pretty rudimentary. His claims about what it means for me to be free without even addressing what the self constitutes of or consists of. If you're going to say that the I can reflect upon the desire and options to smoke, what does it mean for the reflection to occur? If you don't experience the desire to reflect, how can you reflect? The desire to reflect simply happens to you. The fact that the option to reflect occurred to you is nothing more, is not something you choose, and subsequent desires to opt to reflect as opposed to dismiss the thought of reflection is not a desire you choose either. Where is it that you are free within any of this, and what do you think that you mean by you? So I gave a reply to this, and I think these are one of those types of criticisms that I just don't think gets the sort of point. And this one isn't such a bad objection that the idea that it's not such a bad objection that, you know, we can't not criticize, or how should I put this? It's not such a bad objection that, you know, it's not unintuitive, right? This is a fairly intuitive position. That's how I should formulate this. So sort of intuitive position on trying to show what necessarily means for you to talk about the you or the I or the self or subjectivity. And it's a sort of Humean, or at least what I can tell is a sort of Humean-esque skepticism about finding the I in the series of different particular timestamps, right? So in time t1, time t2, time t3, I have all these different types of properties. Do I conjoin them together into some way of where I call that the self? Because for Hume and for other people, the self doesn't seem to show up there, right? It doesn't seem to be a property that shows up. So here I sort of replied in the traditional Kantian kind of way, is that we need to separate, at least in some sense, form and content. Now, form and content can't be completely separated, but the form that one associates with the content seems to be such that the content can change while the form remains consistent. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I look at the I formally, that is a type of unity that synthetically subsumes various different particular contingent relationships like my beliefs, desires, etc. So the form is necessary and the content is contingent. So another way to sort of break that down, if you will, is that we can't have the desires, beliefs, intentions, or any of the sort of attitudes that we have without them being in some way consistent with each other, right? When we talk about the self, we talk about consistency, and we generally talk about the consistency of beliefs. And this means that the mind or cognitive capacities have an ability to relate or synthetically form all of these different types of contingent forms of contents together and subsumes them into the formal identity of the I. And this is what Kant called basically the transcendental unity of a perception, where the I sort of always is co-accompanied by any sort of perceptual content that it synthesizes and subsumes underneath itself. And so here I'd like to say that actions, and this is a sort of Kostgardian move, actions, and when we take actions and when we make decisions, these constitute our subjectivity. Now, one might, another thing that was sort of written in this is, well, we don't have the sort of ability, right? To choose our desires or not to choose our desires, and that's correct, right? Here I'm not, in the debate with destiny, I'm not saying that we choose our desires or beliefs, but that we act in accordance with our desires and beliefs, and sometimes we act in accordance with good reasons that are given to us in ethics. And so when we're doing these types of things, when we're acting in accordance with ethics, or when we're acting in accordance with good reason, then we can't read the fucking font because it's too small. It's probably as big as it's gonna get. Let me see if I can, yeah, I could probably do this. That should be a little bit better. What was I saying? So as long as we're acting with good ethical reasons or with any sort of good reasons, this seems to be a distinct type of causal process in the sense that it's not reducible to the types of causal processes that are working within the biological chemical realm or with mere dispositional properties such as our desire to, say, smoke, right? Because our desire to, say, smoke can be cut off by a good reason, right? Such as us reasoning about the capacities of, or about the dispositional tendencies of cigarettes to cause cancer. And so there's a sort of top-down system of the subject with his intentional actions, with his sort of self-determining powers that can override these prior urges or dispositions or general addictions. Now, there's a lot of comments that I didn't respond to here because I felt like they missed the point, and then just sort of reiterated the argument in another type of way, and then I've already sort of answered what is the form of necessity. Questions like what is the form of necessity? It seems that form you're referring to made up particulars, but that's not what I'm generally looking at when we're looking at forms. Still pretty hard to read. Okay, let's see if we can even get it closer than that. Yeah, so here I'm not really talking about particulars. I'm talking about the form, sort of a conceptual form that puts these all together into one whole. So there's going to be a lot of, sort of disparaging comments, a lot of comments that I think sort of miss the point, names like Tum Jump, who I don't even want to really talk to. So this gets me on to my next point, is that the sort of discrepancy that people brought up with subjectivity and language, and people said that you don't need language in order to have a subjectivity. So I replied to this one too, and I think this is a sort of misunderstanding of when I was talking about subjectivity. So I wasn't talking about subjectivity or the self-simpliciter, I was talking about human subjectivity and the type of subjectivity that human beings have as language users. Presumably one of the types of language capacities or the types of concepts that we employ is that we can talk about things propositionally, and we can reflect upon things propositionally, including being able to reflect upon our subjectivity. And it is not merely that one can act, because any animal can act. It's that the human being can think about how he acts in terms of his propositional stances, and then can go through a set of self-corrective features. So once we get to these self-corrective features, then we are talking about the sort of agency that I'm particularly referencing to, the subject. And only by being aware of the self, which I think can only be done propositionally, the sort of self-awareness, because one has to be aware of the types of beliefs that they have, then we could talk about that type of unique subjectivity that human beings have. That is the notion of self-consciousness itself, knowing that I know about my consciousness. I'm trying to remember this. You say that there's a type of subjectivity that requires language, and therefore the subjective experience is composed of language. If this follows logically, of course, but I for one see no reason to believe that the being aware of your own awareness requires language. And you say in order to talk about it, it requires language, but the experience doesn't in my view. Language is just a way of expressing things that we already experienced. To give you an example of the I, that I am having thoughts, but my knowledge isn't by definition propositional. I just am able to show and express that knowledge in a propositional way. That's another criticism that I replied to, but before I give a sort of vocal demonstration of why that's wrong, I kind of wanted to read the chat real quick. In a few cosmic skeptic debates, he seems to miss the points quite often from what I saw. I wish people were more open to actually reconsider in another person's ideas. I definitely agree with that. Still pretty hard to read. Okay, that's as good as it can get. He shrinks the image to fit. Okay. Okay, so that's fine. So we have no further questions. So yeah, I think that this this misses the sort of point that what I mean by what I think experiences are. So as I've said before in some of the previous videos that I've been doing, is that I think human experience, at least in general, seems to be propositional in form all the way down, or conceptual in form all the way down. Now this is somewhat of a controversial position, but one that I think that I could defend. And the idea even say of perceptual experiences, like say viewing a tree, a chair, a car, isn't that just we're seeing raw data there, right? We're actually seeing things in virtue of their concepts, and then concepts are of course linguistic. So it doesn't seem like these perceptual experiences are non-linguistic. It also seems to indicate that we can have a notion of the I without linguistic capacities, and I'm not really sure if you can have knowledge of the I. You might be able to have an awareness of one's perceptual, like one's raw feels in some way, in some sort of way, like an animal does. But I don't know if that's necessarily an I in any sort of standard sense that I'm thinking about it, which is propositional. So yeah, I don't think that necessarily works. It seems as though when we reflect about the I, we can only form that belief, and we can only justify the belief of the I in relation to what I'm not, in relation to other types of beliefs, and these all fit in together into some sort of semantic holism thesis, or a semantic holistic thesis. Let's go on. I think that's more of the same thing up there. So this next question was by John Smith, and how are second-order beliefs not reducible to antecedent causes? Not the same causes as the first-order beliefs, but clearly factors beyond our control influence how we talk about our thought processes, like education. And so this question is, even if I have second-order beliefs, right, beliefs about beliefs, that is, I form a belief that I was thinking at this one point, and, I make certain types of corrections. How is that not reducible to antecedent causes? Well, there's a distinction between reducibility and dependency upon antecedent causes. So a reducibility thesis would have to basically say that there are some sort of powers that were demonstrated in an earlier position or antecedent condition that overdetermined the types of powers that we see within the human mind. And then there's the one that basically says that, and then the second portion, just the antecedent conditions, is some sort of dependency relationship of the mind to the body and the body to something else, which I agree with. So these aren't the same things. They're a little bit distinct, and here's how I kind of break down, right? There's a distinction between supervenience and reducibility. So the prior says that in change in the mind, there's a change in the physical. So I accept some sort of supervenience relationship that any change in the mind, there's a change in chemistry, and any change in chemistry, there's a change in physics. That's distinct from saying that just because there's a change in physics, or because there's a change in say, chemistry, that those things are the same thing, or make the same thing reducible, or make the mind reducible to those things. I think that that's inaccurate. So again, the body gives rise to the mind, so there are antecedent conditions that lead to the mind, all contingently of which without them we wouldn't have a mind. However, this is distinct from saying that there are physical processes prior to the mind that determines the powers entirely and what its function will be. There will be a form of radical kind of emergentism that comes from it, and new powers mean it's irreducible to the prior context, none of which necessitate what we do. And this question actually is going to feed over into another one that I later on see, if I could find it. There's probably a large accumulation of questions here that I didn't reply to, since I replied to most of these yesterday. This is going to be a distinct criticism. I guess I could go over this one real quick. So another type of objection that we might see to the interpretation argument that I gave, and if we go back to the argument, I'll remind you what that is. This guy is saying, why can't there be an infinite regress of interpretations? Why does it have to be that there can't be an infinite regress of interpretations when we're analyzing what a person is saying? So if this isn't already sort of unintuitively implausible to you, maybe one should sort of begin to think of what an actual infinite, not just a potential infinite set of interpretations would mean. An actual set of infinite interpretations would mean that we have never gotten to the interpretation that we have right now of what a person is uttering. Therefore, we could have actually never been able to know what a person's uttering. And so it doesn't seem as though when we understand what a person's saying linguistically can just be a matter of interpretation. So say, for example, someone uttered that this is a dog. Well, I'd have to know what all those things mean. And he could try to explain what those things mean, but then he would have to explain what those things meant that he's trying to explain. And this occurs ad infinitum. So it can't just be that we have a sort of image in our head that depicts words and utterances like a sign of some sort, just standing still. But rather we have to discard the entire idea that interpretation is just the only thing that's going on when we're understanding languages. Now, of course, I'm not saying that that's not a necessary component. It is a necessary component. I'm just saying it's not a sufficient component. And here I actually offer a argument from McDowell and Thornton. It's a sort of in the sort of syllogistic form. Comes in two forms. If possession of a concept were merely conceived as the grasp of a ratification and independent pattern, then there would be no way of knowing for sure how someone else could understand an expression. And the minor premise is, of course, that it is not the case that there is no knowing for sure how someone else understands the expression, so therefore we can't just say that there is some sort of ratification independent pattern. Oh, hold on, someone's knocking on my door right now. I'll be right back, guys. Okay, sorry about that, I'm back. So picture this argument in a sort of different way. Let's say that a person means something, that content can't be semantically indeterminate. That is, there can't be no fact of the matter of what it means for a person to utter their language, right? There has to be something semantically determinate about that content. It can be ambiguous, but ambiguity is not the same thing as indeterminism of that sort, or indeterminate content. There has to be some way of recognizing what a person has to say, and it doesn't seem to me like this can be done through interpretation alone. It doesn't seem like a person can sort of independently guess at what a person's meaning without that meaning being public, because then the interpretation is always going to be locked off in a sort of private cabinet of consciousness, of where there's going to be a radical contingency between what the person thinks that he's saying and what he's actually saying. Any guess would be as good as the other one. There needs to be something of which one guess is better than the other guess. Something about it that doesn't just lead to another interpretation that leads to this infinite regress. And so the idea here is to basically say that language and meaning isn't something private or invented by one person, or idiolectic meaning. It's actually to say that idiolectic meaning is an illusion altogether, and this is given by the private language argument that we can only have a language if there's some sort of publicity, some sort of dynamic relationship of multiple communities working with each other, multiple people working in a community working each other in order to make linguistic norms possible. That is, to have something that it means to be in or out of accordance with a certain particular word or meaning. Now, people might just keep hampering this point that no, meaning is just created by individuals. It's not a dynamic relationship. But there's a really good reason for why this also doesn't work. Hold on, I'm reading one of these comments here. There's another reason why this also doesn't work. And the idea behind why a singular person couldn't have created meaning in a language is simply there would be no difference for that individual between right and wrong. But surely there is a difference between how one says a word right and how one says a word wrong, right? But if a singular person made every single meaning, right, then what would be the basis of him being incorrect or her being incorrect? There wouldn't be, right? Every single word that they mean, they would just basically say it correctly. They would have no concept of normativity. Normativity would only be possible if there are multiple people basically sort of correcting the individual's use value of those words. So there's a few reasons why this sort of monadic way of constructing meaning is doesn't necessarily work. Now this is where I think it starts to get sort of shaky, is that the sort of criticisms that I had of chemical bonds aren't actually an emergent property in the way he's saying. They're ultimately just interactive interatomic forces on a larger scale. Even what we think of an atom isn't the specific proper blah 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 mishmash. This is what ultimately is going to get into what's called mereological nihilism. And the funny thing is that this exact debate kind of reappeared itself in a dialogue with William Lane Craig and Cosmic Skeptic. A mereological idealism is the idea that nothing really exists. Your dog, that tree, you, none of those things really exist. They're just a different type of assemblage of the same fundamental particles working in the exact same way. But this gets into problems, I think, because then those fundamental subatomic particles, or whatever types of fundamental entities that you want to postulate, are going to have to explain the novelty of new types of causal dispositional powers. Now, presumably, subatomic particles don't have the same types of powers as like your body does. I don't think any sort of subatomic particles goes through homeostasis or metabolism. Some of the examples that I gave yesterday of water being able to put out fire while hydrogen and oxygen is not possible doing that, means that mereological nihilism is wrong, right? Because we have something that's irreducible. So surely the parts that we're talking about on the fundamental level being mishmashed in different types of ways wouldn't be sufficient in order to explain away novelty. That's just the entire point of the non-reductive thesis. So I think this sort of point misses it all entirely. And I give a sort of explanation why it sort of misses it entirely. It's also very, very difficult, I think, in order to say that those fundamental particles are just going to be, in the end, if we can't have a sort of physical reduction, are going to, in any sort of meaningful way, explain the unity of our minds. Because those, I mean, our mind does not seem to be subject to the type of composition that physical things generally are. So I think those are the main criticisms that I kind of saw there. Now, there are some bigger criticisms, basically, that I saw of this one guy here on Destiny saying that I don't understand how physical emergentism actually works. And I think the thing that I think and here I'll happily concede to some of the things that I was wrong on, and it's interesting what I was wrong on. And I think we need to admit when we're wrong. One of the types of points that this individual has stated is that the salt example that I gave of when I said that sodium and chloride or chlorine, neither of those have saltiness to them, but their combination, sodium chloride, salt, is salty. And therefore, nothing about the saltiness is reducible to the sum of its parts, or its parts. And this individual said actually sodium or saltiness is contained in sodium, and that if we're defining saltiness as just basically what activates, sodium receptors within the human body, or salt receptors, then sodium is sufficient enough to do that. So saltiness is actually a reducible property to sodium, and I think he's right about this. I think we have to say basically that saltiness is a reductive process, a reductive property, that we can just sort of amend the idea that we had earlier of saltiness just being inherent within just itself instead of its monadic properties. But then I'm not really sure if he replied to the idea of why or not salty things aren't combustive or poisonous, or really combustive and poisonous when put in together, because it seems to lose that feature when it's salt. I'm also not really sure yet what his reply is to the idea of water not being able to put out fire, being able to put out fire, but its monadic entities can't be put or only agitate fire. So I'm still waiting for a reply there. He also mentioned that it's not right to talk about molecules as monadic entities at all, because what the entity ultimately has for its functional purpose is only going to be given by its relation to other types of things, say certain types of chemical processes or other molecules. But here I actually said that I agree with him that that's always the case, that, or at least it's mostly the case, that molecules of any sort are only going to have the types of properties that they have only through a dynamic repertoire of other parts. And when I go over through my process ontology, that's the thing that I generally hamper on. Certain types of poisons aren't poisonous unless they're poisonous to something. Certain types of things aren't explosive unless they're in comparison to something. So therefore, everything has this sort of polydyadic instead of monadic property. But if you admit that, and I think he might, then in virtue of these polyadic relationships, you're already admitting that certain types of things have powers that the monadic entities don't have, or that the monadic entities wouldn't even exist unless we had a dynamic repertoire of parts. But as soon as we have a dynamic repertoire of parts, I think that that's enough for top-down causation. So I'm kind of curious exactly what he's going to say to this. So he was kind of insulting at first, but I'm willing to take up the issue of what he would have to say to this sort of philosophical spin that I have. It could just be the case that, well, the philosophical spin doesn't matter, and there's just really good physical descriptions that are really reductive and really work out. In that case, you're going to have to pull out other examples, some of which I might pull out later. Off the top of my head, one of my friends mentioned that the helium, what was it that the, I'll have to go back actually, he made a pretty good point here. Yeah, one of my friends made the point that the dynamics of helium, of a helium atom can't be reduced to the dynamics of electrons, protons, neutrons, and photons. So that might be another thing that I might push back on if this form of non-reductive explanation doesn't work. So anyways, let's see what the chat room has to say in the meantime. So someone basically says this is kind of reductive. No, I'm sure I could find someone who can explain the mechanics that goes into making water, being able to extinguish fire, even if both components can't do that alone. Well, I think it follows that if neither of the components can do it alone, and the dynamic repertoire of both of those parts can make something occur, then only through their dynamism or their dynamic relationship do we have that power. So I don't see what it would mean then to say that the parts can reduce it. It wouldn't. Nothing about that would explain it. Let's look at some of the comments. You should zoom in. Willing to turn the other cheek. Okay. So, we'll start the video. Okay. Yeah. How you been doing, Destiny? Oh, that's really loud for me. Hold on. I don't know if I have time to go over the entire video.
Doing pretty good, man. I just came
Let's
out
go
of
over it.
Let's
go
yeah, hey
past
guys.
the formalities.
Yeah, so can we start by the sort of position that you have, why you changed your mind?
I guess I don't think I would necessarily consider myself a dualist. I think a meme word that I use. I've heard people say, well, actually it's panpsychism or some other thing. I don't know what the technical term is for it. But I guess one of my big things is that I'm very big on things that we can interpret using senses. And that we seem to only accept the existence of things that we can like touch, taste, see, fear, or not fear.
So before I go on, this is already something that's sort of bothering me in the chat. Just because we can't explain the mechanics of why some quality emerges doesn't mean that there's no explanation. So this is getting things backwards. What I'm saying before we go on with this video. This isn't an epistemic distinction. It's not that we can't explain things in virtue of their old things. There's, of course, causal reasons for why something occurred when it did occur at any point. There's always a sort of dependence relationship of where no hydrogen and no oxygen, well, no water. Obviously, that's true. The point is that if we have a causal power that's unique, that's not exemplified by the powers of the old one, then that's an ontological difference, not an epistemic distinction. Now, you can say that eventually that we might be able to explain it, and we might be able to find those ontological dispositions given enough time, but that's only saying that we're resting on faith that eventually we'll have a completely reductionistic explanation. But as of now, we don't have a reductive explanation, so we can't say that. This isn't science of the gaps, or God of the gaps. That's more like science of the gaps. The idea that, or more like particle physics of the gaps. The fact that particle physics hasn't explained it yet doesn't mean that it won't eventually, right?
We accept and believe in, but we have like absolutely no way of perceiving those things. It seems to be the case.
Other minds are not perceivable or non-inferential?
What's the difference between those two things again?
Well, something like you could be able to see something like rocks without maybe making inferences about them, right? It would just be something that would just be there that one can kind of see. But one might say that one has to make a sort of inference in order to understand another person's mind, right? And the inference is something like, well, I see them have certain types of behaviors, and then I correspond them to the types of behaviors that I have, and then that corresponds to a certain type of mental state. So that would be a sort of inferential.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can argue that it's inferential, but not inferential in the same way that like a car is inferential from like a series of parts. I think it's something fundamentally different.
Okay. Well, I happen to be of the belief, although I don't know how one would go about proving something like this completely, that mental states are directly perceivable, or like intent.
So this is sort of a strange opinion, right? The idea that mental states are directly perceivable. And what do we mean by directly perceivable? So the idea here is that, again, inferences don't seem to be sufficient to give us access to other minds. Why? Because then I would be forming a belief, and I'd be basing that belief upon another belief, and another belief, and another belief. All of beliefs of which would be presumably private. All of these beliefs of which wouldn't be directly perceivable content of other minds. And so we're not getting direct access to other minds, but indirect access to other minds. And that's exactly what a full-fledged form of inferentialism would mean, a sort of indirect access. That would mean that there is no basis for other minds, which I think would also mean something along the lines for the arguments that I gave before. No basis to really know what people mean and what they're uttering in language, because presumably language is going to be something from what they mean. It's going to be some sort of private thing. But it doesn't seem like it is a private thing. It seems like we can communicate. That's not to say we can communicate perfectly, but we can communicate with some degree. There's some sort of semantic determinacy going about there.
Intentional states are directly perceivable.
Yeah, how?
I don't know if there's a full fact demonstration of it other than like the inverse that is taking the position that it's not is just something that's so odd and doesn't make any sense from our everyday experiences that we can't really hold that position. So if everything was inferential, then it just seems like every single interpretation that we're getting, like the meaning of people's utterances, would just be a sort of guessing game. There has to be some determinate notion of what the person's uttering, what they mean. And for that to be the case, it can't just be inferential all the way down. It has to end, right? Because the meaning of people's utterances has to be interpreted, and we'd have to interpret
I sound
the
like
meaning
Ben
of the
Shapiro
meaning
when
of those
you-
interpretations, so
when
on
you
and so
increase the
forth. So
speed.
there has to be a way of where that sort of regress stops, of where intentional behavior or people's meanings and utterances are sort of directly perceivable at some point.
Wait, how does this relate to what we're talking about now?
It's kind of a deviation.
Oh, wait, I don't know what that means. what do you mean? How does that relate to what we're talking about now? Or can you explain that? What do you mean by deviation?
No, I mean, since you basically made the point of how mental states aren't directly perceivable, I basically said that I do think that they are, right? I think at least mental states in terms of the intentional content of them
It sounds like instead of saying mental states are perceivable, it sounds like what you're essentially saying is that it's hard to imagine them not being, is what it sounded like.
No, no.
Okay, can you explain that again?
Yeah, so by mental states here, I don't mean something like literally experiencing what the other person is experiencing, but at least in some sense, if they're, say, experiencing a tree or mean to say something, like that has certain types of normative content to it that I think is actually viewable by the person who's looking at them, right?
Don't we just make a guess about that content based on how we experience it and we assume it to be true?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It can't be guessing all the way down, right? Because then we'd never be able to actually know what people mean, but we do know what people mean.
But only because we have an experience to use, right? Like, say for instance, let's say for instance you were the only person on a planet that could perceive some color, and the rest of the planet was incapable of perceiving that color.
So there's problems with arguments like this. The idea that everything within our knowledge is just empirically demonstrated through experience. But as we know, there's a few sort of counterexamples to this, and Noam Chomsky actually gives one of us when he sorry, might need to grab some water here in a second, but when Noam Chomsky says that there's no way that when children learn a language that it could all be behaviorally taught. Because even the words that are behaviorally taught, because there, and of course there are certain types of words that are behaviorally taught, doesn't mean that all words are going to be behaviorally thought, because kids and children basically are using sentences in ways that they have never experienced them before. We're able to figure out the grammatical structure of sentences without necessarily needing to know all the rules for them. We seem to be able to sort of blindly do it, as if some certain aspects of linguistic norms are either a priori or directly perceivable. But it cannot be completely empirical, for they're never going to offer us the explanation for why, certain types of children can understand and say certain types of things that they've never been taught before. And also, you definitely don't need to see, and I'm not sure if this is what he said though, certain types of things in order to know anything about them, right? I mean, none of us have directly seen many types of things that we've obviously understand.
How would any of you ever know that?
Well, why does it have to be color? It could be any type of...
It could be anything. I'm just using that as an example.
Right. The point is not to go to that direction. It's basically a soup.
So I say, why are you using color for this reason? So a lot of people love bringing up skeptical... a lot of people like bringing up the argument like, oh, what if my green was your blue and your blue is my green? And therefore color is sort of relative towards the subject and yada yada yada, things like that. But when you commit yourself to this type of argument, generally with this sort of, and this isn't too big into the video that we're actually watching, I just wanted to make a kind of brief point. When someone is kind of getting the argument for the inverted color experiment, that is when we're changing someone's color, how do you know my red isn't your blue? You could do this sort of same thing with any sort of object. It doesn't have to be color, right? You're just at that point using the same sort of tactics as a skeptic would. How do you know my chair isn't your whale? How do you know my whale isn't your chair? How do you know that when you're not saying blue, you actually mean yellow? This is exactly why I kind of attack the interpretation argument in the first place, because this invites some sort of indeterminacy with the notions of what we mean, and exactly sort of denies the aspect of there being any sort of shared experience. So general skeptical arguments like these are sort of hard to refute, and so I don't really see the point of why people bring them up.
Assuming that we're communicating with each other, that we have at least certain types of concepts that could have only been generated through exchange. I mean, languages can only occur through a collective community of people. They can't be just one person's like intentional content put into it. So let me try.
Wait,
to,
hold on,
let
wait,
me-
yeah, wait, because I feel like that's what I'm not understanding. So I guess like my ultimate example would be is like, let's say that I were to construct a robot, and let's say that within that robot, I create a little brain that references every part of the human brain, and then that robot comes alive and talks to me or whatever. Would I just assume that it's having a conscious experience like my own, even though there's no way to perceive that, or why or why not?
Well, how about I give a more simple argument, because this might take
Sure.
us to more confusing things. So meanings, I take it like the meaning of certain types of utterances and like what words mean could only be generated by a sort of community, right? It can't be generated by one person.
And this is just the sort of argument that I gave earlier, right? Something about language needs to be a self-corrective process. We can't just assume whatever types of meanings that we desire and want, and those are going to be dependent upon our own personal intentions. There's a corrective aspect of when I say certain types of things, and I say them incorrectly, people are going to correct me. They're going to do this in a variety of manners, right? They're going to hit my hand and say, no, you're doing that norm incorrectly. You have to correct yourself, right? Someone's giving me a message. I should probably turn that off. So this corrective measure could only exist in a dynamic, interactive community and not an individual one. And it's just the private language argument.
Reason to need to communicate. So languages don't just appear.
And yeah, and another reason is that I don't know what it would mean to talk about a language that was made for oneself. Presumably, a mind doesn't need a language in order to communicate to itself, at least a very basic mind. It seems as though the reason why languages come about is through communication, and that presupposes already that some level of exchange in meaning is transferred from one being to the other.
Out of one person intending to do something, they appear basically from a bunch of different types of people interacting, and they can't be isolated, right? They can't be isolated individuals with boxes on their heads. They have to be interactive communities that create the condition of possibility for language to be such that it is. And once that interactive community is created, then you have a sense of normativity, right? That is normative standards of what words and sentences and propositions mean. You would agree with that, right?
I think this is kind of the idea that there is no such thing as a private language, is essentially what we're
Right.
talking about? Okay.
And he recognizes this, and then yet he makes arguments, evoking private languages.
Yeah.
Now,
one of the types of
okay, yeah, go for it.
And one of the types of things that is sort of a product of our language, or at least the types of cognitive capacities that we have, is self-consciousness. Because there's certain types of concepts and a certain type of language that goes into talking about consciousness, right? We couldn't be the types of self-aware, self-conscious beings if we didn't have certain types of language capacities, correct? We couldn't be self-aware of ourselves because that requires second-order beliefs. Would you agree with that?
I feel like there's probably good arguments on both sides of that, but I guess for the purposes of what we're talking about, sure.
And this is more straightforward than people think it is. Self-consciousness means to be aware of oneself. In order to be aware of oneself, one needs second-order beliefs. In order to have second-order beliefs, one has to have propositional attitudes. That is, I have to think about thinking. Metacognition seems to require propositional attitudes. And this is the type of subjectivity that I was talking about, one that human beings might only have.
Okay, so in order for us to have the type of mind that we do, the type of mind that we generally talk about, the sort of self-conscious state, we need languages, and we need an interactive community. As in, the interactive community that produces the type of self-conscious behavior that we have presupposes a language, and that presupposes a community, and therefore we have to know other people and what these mean before we have a sense of what we are as a human being, as a subject. Would you agree with that?
So you're essentially saying that we have to have interactive relationships with other people in order to use language in order to understand ourselves, or?
Yeah, correct. That's the three kind of premises going on to a conclusion. We need language in order to develop a sense of self-consciousness because that's based upon a language.
Why is that true? Wait, so you're saying that, like, let's say that I was just born in wherever with no human contact, I couldn't develop any sort of sense of self without having another person to have an exchange of language with?
Yeah, you would be maybe aware of your surroundings, but in order to create a notion of subjectivity, right, these require second-order beliefs, that is, thinking about oneself and sort of separating themselves from the rest of the environment, right, creating a sort of divide between.
Think of it this way, again, if you had no sense of self-consciousness, just a sort of minimal awareness, there would be no way of you to conceptually distinguish yourself from the rest of the world. You need some way of conceptually distinguishing one's own unity from the unity of other things, and many things sort of display a sort of inner unity. That doesn't seem sort of possible from a awareness simpliciter, although maybe someone could bring up some sort of empirical studies that would demonstrate that. So,
oneself in the actual external world,
and which I think he tries to.
Language and certain types of
why does that require language? I'm curious.
Because how are you going to discuss the conceptual nature of subjectivity without language?
Why do I need to discuss the conceptual nature of subjectivity in order to be able to perceive myself as being separate from the environment?
How else are you going to do it?
Just through doing it. That seems to be like an innate thing that people can do.
Yeah, that just seems like question begging.
No, like if I feel.
Do you think that like a cockroach or a monkey has a sense of self identity that they can reflect?
Cockroaches, no, but I'm pretty sure other apes do, right? They recognize themselves in mirrors, for instance. They can recognize that that's them if you place something on their head.
So, it's been a while since I've read any sort of material on the mirror test, but hopefully this is one of those things that I could go back on. But the mirror test, I think, has been thoroughly debunked. There's been a number of objections and forms of skeptical arguments basically showing like why an animal viewing itself and being able to recognize itself in a mirror is not the same thing as having self-consciousness.
Can only see it in the mirror, they'll touch their own head in order to do it. I think there are a couple of animals that can do that.
But we would agree, at least in the sense that we're talking about, I mean, they might have some sort of minimal awareness. I don't know if this is the same thing as like knowing that they have an identity or subjectivity, because I think that just requires reflection. I can grant that they have some sort of minimal awareness of certain types of stimuli, but I don't know if they can like talk about themselves as reflective agents like human beings can. And then so far as I'm talking about this type of consciousness, human consciousness, and these types of capacities, you do need the language.
I guess I'll grant it for now, and we'll see where it goes.
Okay. So I'm just basically saying, like, in order to know one's own mind, one also needs to know the normativity of language and generally what other people know, right? One has to know other minds before they also know their mind. So it's not...
Yeah, so this is a sort of symmetry that I wanted to bring, and I should have made a little bit more sense of the symmetry while it was going on in the debate. The symmetry that I'm holding on to is that there's some sense of where we directly perceive ourselves. There's some sense, I think, of where we indirectly perceive ourselves, in as so far as there is some sense that we directly perceive others and indirectly and inferentially perceive others. So there's a symmetry between those two, whereas certain types of people might have an asymmetry that we seem to know ourselves directly in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and we only understand other people indirectly. And that asymmetry leads to something private about the mind. But that leads to a very Cartesian picture of the mind, of where meaning again is private, and not only that, but there's going to be some radical disjunction between some aspects of consciousness and the world itself. So there's a lot of things that one can say about that. One of the things that I would hold on to is a sort of identity theory of truth. And basically saying that if our experiences of the world are true, then there's an identity between our experiences and how the world actually is, because our experiences are of content that is already external. It is not merely a subjective, monadic, private affair. And I tend to think that language kind of also has this weird property that when we're hearing it, we're not just hearing sounds, but we're hearing some sort of normative content to it. There's some sort of normative content in our experience with which is relegating this type of information to us about what people are uttering. And that, in some sense, I think has to be directly perceivable.
Not private. It seems like all of how we know ourselves and how we know others and what they mean seems to both
at least
be
in some
inferential.
sense, not in all senses.
One doesn't seem necessarily private and exclusive.
Okay.
That is, the content of our meaning is public, as the content of other people's meanings is also sort of public.
Okay.
As our language is. Oh yeah, that's all I wanted to express there. This was a sort of going at a different topic than what it was I originally sort of expecting. So I was originally sort of expecting to talk about dualism and sort of overcoming dualism by talking about the mind and things like that.
Well, I guess we can start specifically. I guess, what is dualism? What is that?
Well, it depends on what type of dualism that you hold, right? So there's like a distinction between property dualism and a more radical kind of position, which would be like substance dualism. And I wasn't sure.
Someone asked a pretty good question. Why couldn't it just be that our brain translates sound into meaning? Well, if we want to basically say that sounds are meaningless, and obviously meaning is meaningful, or words and propositional statements are meaningful, then we're going to have to give a description about how causal processes that are meaningless give rise to something meaningful. So why we should be sort of skeptical of that is how can normativity arise from something non-normative? If causal processes in the brain are not operating under certain types of norms, that is, if they don't have directed types of ends, then how is it that a language that obviously does have certain types of norms arises from that? You're going to have to give some sort of reductive explanation for how that's possible, or endorse some form of reductivism, or give, like I do, the rest of the world a form of normativity to it, or conceptual content.
Sure, which one you held, and why you adopted the position that you did. I mean, perhaps you don't know. That's why we're kind of like discussing it right now.
Yeah, I guess so. My current problem right now is that I feel like, for the first time, I feel like that something exists. Jesus. Right now, there seems to be something that exists that I fully believe in, that I absolutely cannot perceive in any physical way whatsoever. So, like, that minds are emergent things that I have no way of telling if they're there or not. I can't do any test with science. I literally, there's nothing I can do, but I still believe that they exist. And I don't know how to speak about them other than, I guess, like in a faith-based manner or whatever, or just, like, inferencing it, I guess, from my own experience.
So, do you not have some experience or reason to believe in intentional states, beliefs, things like these?
What do you mean by intentional states? So you could go over them again.
Like, I intend to go to the park. I intend to play the type of video game that you're playing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I must believe in those, right? At least for myself, right? Yeah.
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 Okay, so you do have reasons to believe those, right? And do you presumably now think that these are non-reducible or reducible to brain states or things like that, or biology or a body?
Yeah, I guess they must be reducible. I mean, it seems to be the case, but it feels like the emergent thing, the emergent property of the mind, that emergent thing seems to be imperceptible. Whereas, like, with a car, it doesn't seem to be the case. I guess I can't know this, but it doesn't seem to be the case that anything new is created when a car is created. That if I take away a tire, I have a car without a tire. If I take away the engine, I've got a car without the engine. Whereas with the human mind, like a conscious experience, I don't know if there are parts of the brain that I can take out where I no longer have a human experience, or like stuff like that. Like that human experience, that conscious experience of an environment seems to be something unique that is.
Yeah, I think that's wrong. So we do have definitely, we have ways of changing the physical structure of the brain such that I could stop having certain types of conscious experiences. Certain types of desires could change. All these things do seem to have, there are certain aspects of the human mind that have reductive explanations to them. And I think I've said this before, I'm not one of those types of people that think that everything about the mind has no reductive explanation to it. I would only say that certain types of things, like second order beliefs or intentional actions, basically, or or reasoned beliefs have, justified true beliefs have a sort of capacity of not being reduced.
It's imperceptible.
Okay. Well, if it's not perceptible and it's unique, and we don't experience those types of powers, or if you want to call them causal dispositions, I mean, these identical powers and causal dispositions are the same thing. And by that, I mean, by powers, I mean something like, electricity, magnetism, elasticity, any sort of causal power. One of the types of causal powers that might be demonstrated within the mind might be the basis of using intentional actions, right? And that type of power isn't seen in the parts that might give rise to the mind. So let's just say that we're talking about the brain or body. None of the types of values, or at least not all of the types of values that we see within the mind, causal powers or those types of values, seem to be indicated or indicative or constitutive of the brain, and therefore they don't seem to be reducible to the brain, right? But I don't think that this is just sort of one sort of unique thing within the world. I think that there's all sorts of irreducible properties within the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to pause it real quick right there. What I'm advocating for here is some sort of univocity thesis, some sort of monism. What do I do to have a univocity? What do I do to show that that's possible? Basically, what I'm trying to argue for here is that everything, as far as I know, seems to reside within the same causal space. That is, another way of putting it in philosophical jargon, causal closure, or the causal closure principle. Now, generally, people want to argue against the mind by, say, arguing for what's called epiphenomenalism, and that is that the mind actually doesn't have any sort of causal efficacious nature to it. The brain and the body and everything physical is the only thing that has causal efficacious nature to it, and therefore the mind is outside of something that's causally efficacious. It's an epiphenomenon. It's not real. And here I'm saying no, it's not quite that. It's actually that the mind does take part and isn't wholly distinct from the types of causal nature that the physical world has, but shares within the same type of causal univocity. And that causal univocity, I think, is sufficient for some form of monism. Sometimes the causes come bottom up. Sometimes the causes come top down. I like a healthy in between. It's just a sort of, I think, a partially philosophical question and a partially scientific question of whether or not we can give completely reductive accounts or not. Let's see if there's anything else to say about that. One could try to deny that causal univocity or causal or sort of the parsimony of monism is not true because everything is causally in the same causal system or causal closure. But then that seems very odd, right? Because then there seems to be a lot of unique properties within the physical world, all of which seem irreducible according to me, somehow managing to interact with each other. It somehow manages to it manages to have some sort of uniformity to it, and also some way of which we can explain one thing in virtue of another thing that seems to some wholly distinct. The fact that we can even explain those mean they both have another similar property to them, namely intelligibility. And so that seems to be something that's also in the same ontological. It seems to have the same ontological character to it in that way. Or if you will, same nature, if you want to forego the philosophical jargon.
Now, whether there are irreducible properties, right, it doesn't mean necessarily that we have to be dualists. It just means we have to be non-reductivists. So what do I mean by this? So let's take, for example, another type of emergent property in, say, chemical bonding, right? Just to get a sort of clear-cut example of non-reductive processes that are emergent but yet are still physical. So imagine salt, right, sodium chloride. And the reason why it's not reducible to the parts is that chlorine and sodium are highly combustive and highly poisonous, taken as monadic or singular entities, right?
Okay.
Now we would imagine if salt is reducible to those two things, it would be that those two things, once put together, are just mere aggregates, making themselves sort of the same thing when taken together. As in, we would expect sodium chloride to be really poisonous and really combustive, but it's actually neither. Instead, we get a new power, which is saltiness, right?
And here is where I sort of admitted I was wrong, right? It's not saltiness. That's not going to be a new thing. However, neutralizing the combustibility and the poisonous in virtue of the new thing, I think, is something that it manages to do. So it definitely seems to negate prior causal dispositional tendencies. As well, what I want to argue generally in philosophy is that causal dispositions don't seem to work linearly or additively. That is to say that just because we have more of one thing obviously doesn't mean that it's going to that the sum of its parts are going to be a conjunction of all those things added together, except even more of that, right? So there's a sort of non-linearity of when we add certain types of things, we're going to get different types of results. So for example, if I have a wound of some sort or an inflammation of some sort on my skin is inflamed, I will apply ice, a sort of ice pack to it, right? And generally ice packs, at least as far as I know, are said to be applied for about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer. The longer you do it, the longer after a while, the longer you do it, it's going to have an inverse relationship of towards where one shouldn't do it because it doesn't have the sort of cost benefits from it. It's not going to be healthy for you. And so adding more of this type of causal disposition to one's skin is actually going to be detrimental. Therefore, things don't seem to always add up in this linear fashion. There's ways of where things do obviously stack up like that or do decrease. I mean, there's all sorts of weird examples that one can use to show the nonlinearity of just aggregating various things that are of the same type.
Saltiness actually neutralizes the poisonous and combustive powers in the original monadic entities. And so what you have here is a sort of non-reductive power, because nothing about the original powers indicates that it should have these two powers, right? Because if it did, then their mere aggregation would be the same new power, but it's not. And so we have a sort of non-reductive.
Hold on, okay, so I don't know if it's going to be this particular example, but isn't that not true? Wouldn't our understanding of how bonds form in chemicals, like, wouldn't we understand why these things are not explosive? Like, this isn't mysterious. This isn't. I feel like this isn't anywhere near the same level as, like, how does a human mind emerge from, brain matter?
Again, this is just a confusion with epistemic distinctions, with ontological distinctions.
Versus why do these two seemingly highly reactive elements come together and form a molecule that's not ultra reactive, right? Like, this is like, I feel like that's really well understood from a chemistry point of view, no?
Oh well, I'm not saying that the phenomenon of saltiness isn't understood. I'm saying it's not understood through its monadic properties, because if it was, then the mere aggregation of it, the value of saltiness would be contained in either sodium or chlorine, but it isn't, right? It's only when those two properties are put together. There's two.
What is this value of saltiness? What do you mean?
Stop stuffing your fat fucking mouth.
It would be a new power, right?
When you say saltiness, you just mean the flavor?
Yeah. But I mean, any other type of characteristic of salt that's not contained in any of the monadic.
And here, I think, this is just going to be really more of the same stuff. So let's skip ahead a little bit, unless anyone had any particular questions here. I don't want to dabble on this debate for too long, since we've gone over a lot of these problems already.
Okay, is that something that you think you would agree?
Yeah, I guess. I don't think it addresses my primary concern yet, but we're maybe getting there.
Well, I don't know what your primary concern is if it hasn't been answered this, but you
So
said
my
like,
primary
there's something imperceptible about it. But that's just to say that there's a new value, a new type of property. But that's just under my third definition of radical kind emergence. It situates it.
So here I'm just saying that, okay, well, let's grant for the sake of the debate that the mind is imperceptible. Let's grant that everything in the entire world is perceptible except the mind. I don't think that this is true. But let's grant that it is. Okay, it has something unique about it, namely the imperceptibility. But this uniqueness is nothing, is nothing distinct from other types of forms of uniqueness that we see exhibited within nature. They might be a little bit strange and esoteric, but they're still just value distinctions or property distinctions or power distinctions. And because of that, I still wanted to have the ontological parsimony that I do in my system, because the alternative to that would be ontological pluralism. That literally that there's just a bunch of different types of things within the world that don't resemble each other in any sort of way. And I do think that there's a bunch of different things in the world, but the many is contained in the one, and the one in the many.
It's all there.
So yeah.
Wait, is this the one you just explained, or is this one you're getting to?
It's the radical kind of emergence. It was the example of the chemical bond that I gave.
The radical chemical bond?
Yeah, radical kind emergence. I gave the example in the chemical bond.
Okay, wait. Can you give me one more example of some kind of radical emergence where, because my problem I don't think is tied as much to emergence, or maybe it is and I just don't see it. I think my problem is more that there is something that I'm currently accepting the existence of that is imperceptible to me. It's that imperceivability that's kind of tripping me up.
So I'm going to pause this just a real quick bit, since this question has been asked a few times. It seems if you could recommend any sort of literature from this discussion. Hey, I'm new here. What's a good book to jump into philosophy as someone green? Also, English is my second language, so a book with not too advanced language would be nice. So those are kind of related questions, but still, unique and distinct. So I'll answer them. This has been asked before. A good way of beginning philosophy is really beginning, I think, and I've given two sort of replies to this. So the one is, the sort of standard one of where you can start with the Greeks and then read Plato and then read Aristotle, and of course they're going to complement each other, and then there's going to be information that's not so novel that you can't begin there, right? Because they're going to be only responding to a handful of people. The basis of philosophical dialogue, at least within the Western Hemisphere, is going to begin somewhere right there. The problem with doing that and starting with the Greeks and then going forward is that it's going to take such a long time by the time you reach any sort of contemporary philosopher that a lot of the questions that we're going to be asking yourself are going to be so linguistically are going to be situated in such a linguistically different way because of all the various types of new, minute splits that we make, that it's going to be really hard to incorporate the Greeks in modern day language. But one could get secondary guides and do that if they really wanted to. Or one could do this, is basically start anywhere, pick a philosopher, and then find some sort of secondary guide. Presumably something within maybe the last 200 or 300 years, like Kant. I mean, it's a very good start, honestly, in my point. Get some guides there, and then see how he compares to modern literature and what he has to say there. Or just read modern, contemporary literature from either the analytic or continental standpoint. You can read Wittgenstein and guides to Wittgenstein. You could read just very specific books about specific things. So one book that I'm reading right now, actually about what exactly subjectivity is, and this was recommended to me by John, is Self-Constitution by Christina Kosgard. If you really want to know about subjectivity and why it's a unity and why it's has hylomorphic features, read that. If you want to read about some of the things that I'm saying about conceptual realism and this idea that conceptual content exists out in the world, I would read John McDowell, or I would read a secondary book about John McDowell. Specifically, the one that I'm thinking about is John McDowell, second edition by Tim Thornton, which I'm also reading. There's also some literature within non-reductionism. I think one is by the philosopher of science named Nancy Cartwright. One of the books that she does is The Dapple World, A Study of the Boundaries of Science, and I think she might give some sort of non-reductive explanations there. Or one could look at the history of philosophy and buy, say, Routledge guides to, say, Spinoza or Hume or Kant, and those are very, very useful in themselves. And so I've, in essence right here, tried to explain not just where to begin, but also some of the literature that I've been reading in terms of this discussion. Primarily the reductive or non-reductive stuff that I'm talking about in the discussion is from Stephen Mumford. And I've done that in another previous, segment, one of the shows that I did. I talk about getting causes from powers is the book that I've read in order to get my information from there. A lot of my other information is going to be from John McDowell, Kant, Hegel, kind of put together. Although it's really hard to say whether, all of the sources that I have or all the knowledge that I have come from any particular set of books. Because I've read quite a few philosophy books by now, definitely, over probably a few hundred. So it's really hard saying exactly where I'm pulling from my information at the time. Although definitely the most relevant information is going to be from the most, from the books that I've been reading lately. You tend to forget information.
Yeah. Can
Why is imperceptibility like anything? I mean, I understand that it's not going to be in, say, like biology, if that's how you kind of view it, but I don't understand why this is any different from any other type of new value or emergentism.
Well, because most values are perceptible? I can't think of any other values that I have, or are there things that I believe in that are literally imperceptible?
There's a lot of things that are imperceptible.
Can you give me a few so I can understand what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, you can't perceive subatomic particles, right?
Kind of, but like those things are like there's a difference when I say like imperceptible versus like when
So here we're gonna get into a debate about what imperceptibility means. And I think when I say certain types of things like subatomic particles aren't perceptible, I mean that we can obviously see the causes of, or the effects of, subatomic particles on a macroscopic level. Um, but that's just going to mean that we're making inferences about what's occurring on the subatomic level. We're not directly perceiving those. But if we're making inferences instead of direct observations, then the same way we make inferences about other minds is the same way that we make inferences about theoretical physics or subatomic particles. So, so there is really no asymmetry there, I think, according to, despite what Destiny's saying. Now, it might be said that the distinction between something being inferential and directly perceivable is, and actually this is one of the criticisms given to me in the Reddit thread, is cannot be rigorously defined. And that's another argument that you're going to have to give. I'm still not sure if I quite see why we can't make the distinction. I have seen some moves that might make me conceive of there being a distinction a lack of a distinction there. But I think ordinarily you're going to have to say why this distinction that I'm why this sort of symmetry that I'm speaking of is not valid.
When I say imperceptible, I mean like things that can't be measured in any way that a human can understand. So, for instance, like
yeah, indirect perception just means that you're making sort of inferences in order to get at what you're perceiving instead of it just being sort of there.
Subatomic particle might be imperceptible just because we don't have the eyes to like focus down at that level and see those things, or because photons don't interact with those things in a certain way. But like I create a tool to measure it, for instance. But like I couldn't imagine creating a tool to see like is a mind.
So I'm not really sure if there's really much to say there. Let me skip forward a little bit.
Univocity, that is the same type of being.
And yeah, here I just talk about the sort of parsimony of being, or the univocity of being. It's just another way of saying that everything is one. Let's go to communication.
Right, so, I mean, we could do a discussion on that. I mean, some other time. But the literature there is just a little bit more hairy because I think if a person's really skeptical, they're just going to deny that any sort of intentional actions that are demonstrated, they're going to be just behavioral, spatial temporal changes. They're not going to tell us anything about the intentions of the person. I guess that's the position that you hold, and it's really hard to argue with someone about not believing in that without taking some presuppositions that there obviously are other minds and that there obviously is a sort of communication between other people, right? And that obviously language means, like, words mean something, certain types of propositional statements mean something, and we are actually getting at what people mean and not just guessing. If you believe in that, then I don't see how you could just say that, that the world doesn't have any sort of properties that might just not be, God, I'm trying to use a language that's not too convoluted, yeah. Just like that the world has some sort of directly perceivable forms of content that give us information about other people's minds and what they mean, right? Something has to be like that, directly perceivable and non-inferential. Otherwise, everything just reduces to guessing.
This is just more of the same sort of argument that I'm making. This is that, meaning can't be just within the head. Meaning has to be in order for us to communicate meaning, there has to be something public about that meaning. It's just, again, this is going to be kind of more of the same thing. And then briefly, since, we've kind of gone over most of this, briefly I do go over idealism. And someone asked me, whether I'm an idealist, but that question is sort of semantically indeterminate, if you will, I guess, or semantically ambiguous, because what the word idealism means is a whole bunch of things, just a whole bunch of historical things that, depending on the philosopher that you're looking at, will lead you to different types of positions. And I said as much, here.
All right. So did you have anything else, or you wanted to end it on that note?
I think I'm okay for now, unless you have anything you can think of. Wait, somebody said I should ask you if you're an idealist.
It depends on what they mean by idealism, because idealism has like several forms. Some people are subjective idealists, of where they think that the world depends upon my mind, whereas I'm saying that my mind depends on the world. So we wouldn't have experiences of any sort if there wasn't some sort of content that they latch onto within the actual world. And that's what I'm saying that's why I'm saying that experiences aren't this private phenomenon that are independent of the world. They aren't just like internally reproduced, right, or like self-created. When I'm experiencing a tree or another person, whether it be and other minds, there's something about my experience which includes or incorporates that type of content. And for me, that's, as we know, conceptual content, because I don't think it's just seemingly random information that doesn't make any sense. I think it's actually conceptual information that is intelligible. I think that the universe has a sort of intelligible structure to it that we create judgments upon. But there's different types of idealisms. That one is, the one that I mentioned is just subjective idealism. There's the Kantian version of it, the transcendental idealism. Then there's the Hegelian version of it, which is absolute idealism. Schelling also has absolute idealism as his metaphysical stance. Then there's the British idealists, and then there's probably some sort of New Age idealism that I'm not familiar with as well. So. But to answer that question, I'm an idealist realist or an absolute idealist. If you guys want more of a definition of that requires obviously more legwork. So.
Another way of talking about idealism and realism, since we're no longer in the middle of this debate, is just saying that the content of the world is conceptually latent instead of non-conceptually latent. That is, that we don't just we don't just make sense of the world through our minds alone. Is that the world has to be already ripe for intelligibility in order for us to make sense of it. So non-intelligible things are obviously not going to be intelligible. They're not going to be able to enter into any form of our epistemic justifications. So it seems as though the world seems to be conceptually latent, or has a sort of form to it, or if you want to get into Aristotelian jargon, a form of hylomorphism between its content and its form, its intelligible form, that a subject recognizes and is able to take that form of normativity into their own into their own beliefs, into their own belief system.
Okay. Anything else?
How about this? Before we, since we're running out of content here, what's your stance? I guess on free will, and we'll go on that one.
What do you mean by free will?
Just the ability of making certain types of free actions, right?
I'm sorry. Well, talk.
And so the rest of this debate is basically going to be about free will and what that constitutes and yada yada yada. I can't remember if I went over one comment on YouTube about someone sort of criticizing me about causal determinism and why we can't have free will because of causal determinism. So here are, I think, two big sort of errors that people have that lead them to the conclusion that everything is predetermined and everything is necessitated by initial conditions. So there's a distinction that we need to make between determinism and causal necessitarianism. So the idea that a cause necessitates its effect, I think, needs to be proven. Why is it not possible that another type of effect couldn't have come from the same type of cause? If a person is saying that it necessitates that cause, that means in all possible worlds that there couldn't have been anything that inhibited from it being something else, which I think is fairly unintuitive, and not just unintuitive, but needs to be argued for. So there's a distinction between saying that an effect has a cause and an effect is necessitated by a certain type of cause. And therefore there's going to be a distinction between accepting determinism and accepting necessitarianism. And the second problem with any form of free will is just because that biology and chemistry led to my mind doesn't mean that they're reducible to my mind, as for the arguments that I've given before. So it could be the case that certain types of intentional actions are just not reducible to the types of antecedent conditions that we were just talking about earlier, with, say, chemical bonds or whatever. And that top-down causations, or a top-down intentional structure, might just actually be a better route to take. And there's some sort of air for free will. Also, there's also the problem that just because there are antecedent conditions, and necessitarian was true and reductionism was true, and just because there are antecedent conditions does not mean that we don't have a free will either. So let's say that I was wrong about all those things. There's still a distinction between acting upon one's own intentions, desires, or reasons, ones that they have, and say being caused by a car to go certain types of ways, right? And by a car hitting me in a certain type of way, we just mean it literally, accelerates with a certain type of And as a certain type of acceleration, certain type of mass hits me, I obviously fly back. I never intended to do that. That's obviously a different type of causal structure than, me intending to pick up a cup, and that's just in accordance with my dispositions. The idea isn't to try to find some sort of initial cause that we somehow chose before choosing. You can't have a desire before a desire. You can't have an intention before one has an intention. There's no such thing as a free action that is wholly undetermined. But there is an action that is at least not reducible towards the types of earlier actions that we talk about, in case of irreducible actions. And there does seem to be a distinction, at least in nature or the quality of our actions, say, between me choosing to pick up a cup and me being hit by someone and not choosing anything, right? To offer another type of experience of making kind of more sense of this, imagine two possible worlds. Both of them are deterministic. Hell, we can even make them both necessitarianistic, if that's a word, of where all actions could have only been one way. However, there's one distinction in both of these possible worlds. In one, I have intentions that are being controlled by. Sorry, I'm not having my intentions produced, or I should say, I'm not following my actions because I want to, but because there's a puppeteer guiding all of them. Whereas in the second world, I have intentions and I'm doing them regardless of there being no puppeteer. So if there is a puppeteer making all of my actions, both of these worlds are deterministic. It still seems as the puppeteer is, breaking what I want and what I intend to do and my free will. Whereas the second world, even though it's deterministic, the puppeteer is not guiding my actions, and therefore I seem to be acting in accordance with them, and so I have free will. But this is a sort of last-ditch, I think, solution to incompatibilism. So, but I don't think there's really much more to say here on the free will debate that I haven't already kind of gotten over with a few examples earlier in the stream. The last bit is about police reform. Which, surprisingly, most people didn't have any comments about. I think there might have only been a few comments, and that was from my friends. And someone brought up the comment, and I think this is probably the most interesting out of these comments that I made in the last bit of this debate. Someone criticized me for not believing in human nature. And I think they were missing the point of what I meant by saying that there's no such thing as a human nature. Now, of course, everything in the world that exists has a human nature to it. Has a nature to it, and humans presumably exist, and they presumably have a human nature to them. But what a nature means is never in isolation, and is never inherent in some sort of disposition, is never inherent in some sort of state of where it's cut off from the rest of the world. Even in biological development of when our genetics are being created, or say our epigenetics are being created, or when we're going through the world, there's always some level of environmental influence of which is going to change our nature to the degree that we'd have to say that our natures are completely contingent. And that seems to be in par with evolutionary explanations too, because if natures were something essential to themselves, if they could never change, if they were just operating under certain types of conditions that were in stasis, then we could have never evolved, and we could have never changed changed to the type of creature that we are. So a person who basically wants to be an essentialist about human nature, unless they have some sort of radical arguments that I'm not unaware of, has to basically say that evolution doesn't exist, which I think is a very controversial belief. Now, there might be some sort of consistent essential features to human life, and we know these may be something as being self-organization, metabolism, homeostasis, and whatnot. That's not to say that, you know, human beings characteristically act in any sort of essential way, that their personalities are any essential way, that there's some sort of biological, genetic determinism that's going to therefore determine how intelligent they are the rest of their lives, right? This is what creates certain types of forms of racism, right? This is what creates forms of prejudice or misogyny, is when we say that there's some sort of inherent first thing that a body has that is just going to therefore be malleable and susceptible to other types of things, but that original thing is still always going to be there. So that seems very highly implausible to me. Why I bring that up is because the conversation that I had with Destiny in the very end was just basically going against the general idea that people have of the broken window thesis. And the broken window thesis is just, again, imagine that there's something in the neighborhood, something subtle, small, like a broken window. Because people see this, they're going to have a sort of natural tendency to break other windows or do other petty crimes, right? And what's sort of invoked in this broken windows thesis should be sort of now apparent to you, right? A natural, biologically deterministic sort of set of principles that will never change depending upon the culture and the context or the environment, that people are always going to be naturally disposed towards this. And then we have a priori from the get-go a way of answering all types of things that we should in when we're considering police manners, and that is, hell yeah, let's crack down as police officers, and we need to crack down by giving more tickets, by being more violent, by policing more, or something like that, right? That's obviously not the case. So what you could instead do, if you don't see anything essential there, is to make the reasonable and quite easy point that, okay, well, these behaviors and characteristics are actually going to be indicative of larger sociological issues, of even larger biological issues, such as maybe their diet, their nutrition. I mean, these types of responses have been given so often that, in my opinion, the idea of holding on to biological determinism is sort of an antiquated notion. What do you think of? Someone just said that that's an uncharitable interpretation. I don't think that that's an uncharitable interpretation. So I think the inverse, holding on to some sort of biological deterministic thesis, is exactly what's going to get you into things like the book Bell Curve, or that there's going to be some sort of essential differences between African Americans and Caucasians or something like that. What do you think about Chomsky's argument about language processing? It depends on what you have in mind. So I'm not really sure exactly what you have to say there. The philosophy chat, I think I probably agree, not quite sure, but that argument sounds invalid to me. A human nature or unchanging qualities to human beings does not contradict evolution, since it is a change and adaptation over generations. Well, but I agree that there's some level of consistency or some sort of consistent properties that might range over a small period of time, but I think that the way that human beings have been and will continue to be is a contingent matter. That is, I don't see a reason why there couldn't be certain types of historical biological processes, chemical processes, cultural processes of some sort that inhibit the general physiological or reasoning processes of a human being. There might be certain types of essential ways that human beings think. That is, I think they tend to think as in terms of some sort of consistent manner. Like, you have to believe the idea that, human beings, particular human beings, exhibit a an inner unity of some sort. That most human beings seem to have a language capacity seems to be about consistent, but there do seem to be some that don't. So that one might be out of the ballpark. And generally, things that I do think are essential to the human mind and not the body. So, yeah, I don't know. Destiny also did mention at one point in the very end of the police reform that the broken window thesis occasionally proved to be accurate. If it was occasionally proved to be accurate, and there's a lot of studies saying that it's inaccurate, this I think might amount to a clock being right twice a day. That is, you're going to find certain types of scenarios that might just be consistent with that hypothesis, but are consistent with that hypothesis incidentally instead of non-incidentally. So I'm not really sure if most of the studies suggest that if that's going to be right. So sorry if you guys wanted me to go, step by step through this video. I know I did that with the last one, but going over some of the comments earlier in definitely made it such that I kind of got a lot of the questions answered beforehand. So we've been talking about 2 hours, and I think it's about time to wrap it up. If we have any last few questions in the chat, I'm more than happy to answer them. I will say that the questions that I saw and some of the criticisms that I saw this time around in the debate were much harder to answer. I definitely had in that Reddit thread probably have to concede to some sort of empirical descriptions. And I definitely also have beginning to see that it's quite hard. It's quite hard arguing for things like the direct perceivability of human minds. That's very difficult. Hell, I mean, it's very difficult even arguing that other minds exist, and that it's not just a matter of fate. Although if we are philosophers, we shouldn't be satisfied with the idea that something can be sort of faith-based to begin with. While people are asking any sort of questions, that is, if there are going to be any questions, I want to just give a shout out and a thanks to anyone that has followed. So thank you to Divine Neo, the Silver Nico, X Kryler, Quayumi, Sunglasses Cats, Deep Estate, I Memberino, Villy 101, Mr. Quagmire, Real Diplomat, A Fool's Folly, Naloom, Dark Void, Oxera, I don't even know how to pronounce this one. It might just be Babel. Exo Store. And we also got as well the final thanks to, we got a few more. Reed Delea Funte, Kurt TD, Cercio Wrights, N8 Juno, and Airbryn, Booger's Guard. God, we got some names here. Oh yeah, and Valt. Thanks for following, Valt. Or Vaults. Any specific thoughts about William Lane Craig and the cosmic skeptic debate? Do you respect Craig, or would you say that he's into the Plantiga character? You seem not to like Plantiga. I don't like Plantiga too much, but I don't want to say anything ill of Plantiga. I did like his evolutionary debunking argument, and I can't even remember the reasons why I disliked Plantiga maybe a while back ago, but it could have been just something that I read a while back ago. So what do I think of William Lane Craig? I think I should say a few positive things about him and a few negative things about him. I think when I first encountered him, I sort of I sort of had a dislike for him because I didn't understand some of the arguments, and then when I started agreeing with his arguments more, I liked him more, and I noticed that there's quite a few people that sort of misunderstand William Lane Craig's cosmological argument and ontological argument, and all that. Hold on, let me open up actually that debate: Cosmic Skeptic and William Lane Craig.
You can say all.
I'll do this really quick and. Okay, that's not what I want.
I want.
So what was I going to say? Yeah, so there's a few things that I agree with and that I like about William Lane Craig. First of all, I think he's a really gifted debater. He's very good at diffusing a lot of issues, and I think he was really going easy on Cosmic Skeptic this debate. I mean, I think he was going super easy, and he was being super humble and super modest, and kind of showing, in a nice way, the radical commitments that Cosmic Skeptic had. And one of those commitments that I wouldn't let for even 5 minutes stand is that mereological nihilism that Cosmic Skeptic holds. So in this debate, I just don't think that you can hold mereological nihilism as a serious form of objection to the cosmological argument. As a matter of fact, I think that William Lane Craig, maybe in a post of some sort, argues that this is one of the top 10 worst objections to the cosmological argument. And so I think he does a damn good job in basically showing a lot of points in this debate that I thought were very well articulated. What I don't like about William Lane Craig is when he starts arguing things like you need a god in order to say that ethical realism is true, and he sort of appeals to this Dostoevskian point. Let me see if I can find it in the video.
I mean, you can take that line if you want.
Anti to the universe would surely imply coming into existence. Let me.
So you can't say that only things of actual price tag of non-belief.
T is an R time.
With regard to the universe, though, this is all academic. Agent endowed with freedom of the will
exist doesn't have a cause.
Yeah.
So
and this fact,
might not be able to fight it here, but this is William Lane Craig's classic position against moral realism that has no God in it. And it's the same one that Dostoevsky has. If there is no God, how the hell do we have morality? It seems as though everything would be based upon a subjective basis. But I don't see any inference that can guarantee that point. It doesn't seem like he doesn't seem to have an argument for why moral properties can't exist outside of themselves without any sort of subjectivity. I don't see why he is against, say, the constitutivist who thinks that moral properties, or moral reasoning at least, is going to be guaranteed by a human agent. So they're not going to be properties that exist within the world, but they're going to be a set of properties through a dynamic repertoire of people and their minds. Sort of constructivist notions of ethics. You could be you could hold a bunch of different types of positions and begin arguing for them, which is exactly what moral realists do, right? They will argue for these types of positions. As a matter of fact, there was a debate with William Lane Craig and Shelley Kagan about this very issue. And unfortunately, Shelley Kagan did not press William Lane Craig too hard about the issue of not needing God for morality. That's one of the biggest types of objections that I have. Another type of objection that I never see William Lane Craig answer, but he might have a billion answers to it for all I know, is his response to the problem of evil. So the idea there is, obviously, how can evil be permitted if God is all good? And William Lane Craig basically says something like, okay, well, we need to make a distinction between our emotions and our intellectual capacities of reasoning about the world. Now, on an emotive level, on an emotional level, there's all sorts of suffering and pain, and this is really bad, and, there's no way of reconciling that. But on an intellectual, philosophical level, okay, well, God, who knows what God did, because God is almighty, all-powerful. We don't know what God could possibly do. Maybe his infinite goodness made the best of possible worlds for us, such that all this evil that looks like evil is actually not evil. We don't know, but we do know God's existence. Things like that. So this reply that William Lane Craig gives, another name for it is, I think, called skeptical theism or skeptical theology. I'll have to look into it, or theological skepticism of some sort. I can't remember the name of the position. The problem with this position is you can't both be a Christian and believe in both that the nature of the good is a fundamental mystery, and at the same time say that we can recognize good and evil within the world. Because presumably the Christian wants to say that, well, we do detect the good and evil within the world. When someone kills or murders an innocent individual, they know that that is evil. They at least know at least one belief, right? They at least have one belief that's presumably justified, I would have to say. And presumably, if we have at least one justified belief that there is good and that there's evil within the world, then we can logically just ask the question of why this evil was permitted, and if God's nature is all good, that's obviously incompatible. It doesn't matter how many types of skeptical replies the individual gives when he says that God's nature is unknown, unless he's saying that all of our beliefs are can't impossibly, in any sort of possible way, track the good, right? And I've never really seen William Lane Craig give a sort of reply to this, so I'm curious if he has a sort of reply to that. He might. He might have a reply to that. So outside of those two things, I think the third thing that I would sort of ask William Lane Craig is what is wrong with pantheism and what is wrong with panentheism, because I've never seen anyone bring up to William Lane Craig why he would not hold both positions. Maybe pantheism would be something that he could jettison away fairly easily, because of the radical contingency of the universe. That might be something that he thinks. But that does not explain away panentheism, of which would say something like maybe nature resides within God, because he has a sort of orthodox classic theistic view of where nature is distinct from God. And even if the cosmological argument worked, and even if we had some level of proving God's existence, I don't see why that would prove God's existence as being radically different from all of nature. So those would be the three types of questions that I would have with him. And that's not to say that he doesn't have a reply to them. And even further, I think he would absolutely slaughter me in any sort of discussion or argument that I would ever have. You know, I wouldn't put up all those objections that Cosmic Skeptic had in any sort of way with confidence if I was to have a dialogue with William and Craig. I would push him on some of these issues, but I think the level that he could push me would be way, way, way of a different type of caliber than how I could push him. And that's just because, you know, I mean, how old is the guy? I mean, this guy has been doing this forever. I mean, William Lane Craig is 70 years old. So, I mean, the idea that he wouldn't have every single reply to every single position, anti-theistic position that you hold is, you know, uh, isn't incredibly naive, I guess, but unlikely. So, yeah. I think because of his foundationalist belief, the moral argument isn't very convincing for me. He says that in the Shapiro video. I don't think he says it in this one. Yeah, I think he says it in the Shapiro video. Yeah, thank you for reminding me, Clem. He does say that in the Shapiro video, but I think he says that in other places as well. If we do prove that the cosmological argument for the existence of God works, we could only prove at the very most that that a necessary being exists. It would not prove the Abrahamic Christian God as far as I know, because then we'd have to prove why God is intelligent, has a mind, has anything like free will, that we have any sort of standard of free will. Yeah, I mean, because it's one thing to argue for the cosmological argument or the ontological argument and prove that they're right. It's that they have to do divine psychology after that, and divine psychology is mostly a speculative venture. So they're going to have to speculate on the divine attributes of God, none of which I think can be necessarily proven if you have a classic theistic conception of God. And I haven't done a video on debunking the cosmological argument or the ontological argument, but I do think that there's some good replies there. I think the best reply is given by Kant. But that's something that I'm gonna have to save for another day. So God as value is true. Well, if we want to call the necessary being that creates all of the cosmos as being God, if we were just saying that God is identical to the thing that created the universe, then yeah, you can say that, God created the universe. But that's not generally what people mean by God, right? They have a very Abrahamic conception of him as something with a mind, as something that is by nature intrinsically good. All these things have to be argued for. So, yeah, I think that... Okay, hello. Of all the 3/4 of the big theistic arguments, the moral argument is the weakest in my opinion. Cosmological seems the strongest. Yeah, I'd have to say that the cosmological argument, and not even the Kaleem cosmological argument, but the classic cosmological argument that Thomas Aquinas gives, the argument from contingency, seems to be the strongest argument. Although, of course, it rests on what's known as the principle of sufficient reason, meaning that everything that has an effect has a cause. And this you can deny as well, which is what certain types of people like William Lane Craig and Phaser Edward Phaser wants to defend, right? They want to defend the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason. And that gets into debates that are going to require a lot of research into modality, I think, because I had a conversation actually with Rasmussen over the email about the principle of sufficient reason and why he thinks that it doesn't entail necessitarianism. But there's a huge debate before I go, guys, that the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, that everything has a cause, necessitates necessitarianism. So the argument is something like, if a necessary being created an event, that event has to be necessary too. There cannot be any cause which leads to an effect that isn't necessary if the original condition is necessary. And the PSR, when it's searching for a cause, it's searching for basically all possible explanations of what didn't occur and what did occur. And if we find all the possible explanations that didn't occur and that did, it only leads us to finding out that the one that did occur was the only one that could have happened. It gets into these cosmological arguments get very, very, very nitpicky. And I don't know necessarily how I myself would be able to have any real commitments there. I don't want to commit myself to some of those arguments. I mean, a lot of classic theism is very, very interesting, but if even one premise falls there, you know, there goes your entire God. There goes your, like, basically 90% of your metaphysics. So anyways, guys, I think the ontological argument seems most convincing, but that could be a semantical trick of that kind that lures people in. Yes, I think it is, actually. Anyways, guys, thank you for joining me in the stream. We've definitely had a lot more viewers than in any stream before, just by having a discussion without Destiny. So definitely come back. We are going to have a discussion with one of my friends, a person that hasn't been on, a conversation basically with Grant at 2 p.m. CST on Thursday tonight, this week. So just to kind of give you some information on what it's going to be about, it's basically going to be about the analytic continental divide. In case this conversation hasn't been already beaten to death, in case we haven't beaten the horse to death already and beaten it even further after it's died, we're going to have a conversation about that. And we're going to have a conversation slightly after that about Sigmund Freud and Kant in relation. We're going to have a conversation about how ethics originated using the philosophy of Freud and Kant synthesized together. Or at least Grant will, since this is what he is working on. So let's see if that's successful. Okay, guys, until next time, join us then Thursday. Thank you for coming. You guys have a good one.